Korea marks a solemn anniversary this week. That is the start of the war on the Korean Peninsula on June 25th, 1950. On Press Perspective today, we cover this past event and the present efforts to honor the selfless sacrifices of the soldiers. Welcome to Wednesday's edition of Press Perspective for June 24th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. 76 years ago this month, war broke out on the Korean Peninsula when North Korean soldiers crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. Over 40 member nations of the UN sent troops, equipment and humanitarian aid to South Korea. And South Korea, for its part, continues to honor this tangible support for freedom and democracy. For more on this, I have Thomas Maresca with the American news agency UPI here in the studio. Thomas, welcome back.
Thanks, great to be here.
I also have Chloe Borgnon with French broadcaster France 24 with us. Chloe, it's great to have you here.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Right, Thomas, the Seoul-Washington excavation effort, it's said to be one of the longest running humanitarian and military cooperation projects on the Korean Peninsula. Could you tell us a bit about how this project began and what's its latest mission?
Yes, so this is a project to locate, recover, identify the remains of soldiers that were killed or went missing during the Korean War. And you know, the U.S. has been doing this, I think, almost since the end of the war. But for South Korea, I think they really formalized their own efforts around 2000. They formed it's called MACRI. It's like Killed in Action Recovery and Identification Group, and the U.S. Side of that is called DPAA for short. And they began working together in the early 2010s, basically, and have run just a number of you know, missions around former battlefields, you know, and sites of aircraft crash sites and other locations where you know, missing service members could be buried. And so last month they began their latest one of these ventures, and it's actually, I think, due to end later this week, but it's a month-long. You know, basically it's more of an investigation process. They're covering 6 locations, including some areas where I guess they knew that the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division suffered heavy casualties in 1951. And one of the sites is Hongcheon in Gangwon Province, where they said there's 13 personnel missing, and Yangpyeong in Gyeonggi Province, where there's 37 killed or missing. And you know, the idea is basically to find promising sites for future excavations. You know, speaking with, I mean, the historical record, and I think they speak with locals about, you know, where they knew some fighting was. And they also mentioned they're planning for some underwater searches for aircraft crash sites and missing crew. And then, you know, they'll take that and build out their plan of action, you know, to recover afterwards.
Right. Chloe, do tell us a bit more about the actual work of this excavation effort.
Yeah, so there is, as Thomas has been touching upon, 6 regions at the moment that have been searched in South Korea. There's also another main excavation area that's not currently being used and being researched, but it's back into the radar of the South Korean government, which is White Horse Ridge, in Seoul, Gangwon Province. So it's in the DMZ area, which makes it a bit special because of the restriction and regulation that have to be put in place over there. But so those are the main area that are currently into the target for those efforts of research. And actually what they do is quite specifically made into different steps. So the first one is to research the spots that should be searched. Like, obviously we're not going to go all over South Korea and just try digging. So as Thomas was mentioning, they actually do some research that are kind of historical research, trying to find through military archives where people were missing or were killed in combat, asking people who were their testimonies at the time, when they were combats, when they were living in the region, where was that, where could it be. Once they have all done that, there's some specific steps then for the research that's done in the DMZ, demilitarized zone. That is obviously safety measures, so mine clearance and securing the access route, making sure with the UN body that's overseeing the use and the going and leaving the DMZ zone that they're going to be coming in here. So that's this one is very specific obviously to the DMZ. And then there's the excavation part itself. So it's like very similar to archaeological research actually. So they'll be searching for any remains, but also any objects that could later help for the next step, that is identification, which is obviously very hard because we're long time afterwards. So some of the remains, it's hard to know who they are. So they're saying that they're actually doing it with the objects that are found on the people. So trying to see, for example, military identification, dental prints also. And right now they're doing also a lot of DNA testing to know who the people, who the bones and remains we have are. And the idea is that once they are identified, they can be then repatriated. So for the US soldiers, they will be sent back to the United States through special ceremony and hopefully given back to the family members that are still alive today. So that can take some time, obviously, because, for example, last month they were doing DNA testing and formal identification on bodies that were found in 2010, 2012, and 2020. So it can take quite a few years, actually, to be able to do this whole process. But it's good to see that this is a work in progress, and there's really a will to really try to find those people and send them back to their countries.
Right, for sure. Thomas, what has been said about the significance of this joint project between Seoul and Washington?
Yeah, I think it's seen as, a very meaningful, just expression of the U.S.-South Korea military alliance that, usually when we talk about it, we talk about it on this program or we cover these stories and it's, deterrence and the joint exercises and what's happening politically. But this is, the sort of underlying, meaning of what this alliance was about, so I think, it speaks to the credo, certainly the U.S., this is a U.S. military, sort of slogan, and I believe South Korea has something similar, where it's the idea of no one getting left behind, and so that even if it's decades later, that I think really animates the spirit behind this. And, as Chloe was mentioning, just the idea of identifying and being able to share with the family members, has just a strong sense of giving some answers and some closure to the family members, so that it's kind of fulfilling this promise to service members that they won't be forgotten, and they won't be left behind. And and I think for the U.S.-South Korea relationship, it is working side by side on this humanitarian aspect of the military relationship, which we don't see or think about as much as the kind of the practical side, and as well as also, Chloe was mentioning, this kind of archaeological aspect to it, though there is, it is a way of preserving historical evidence from battlefields, and especially as the environment changes, the areas become developed, so there is a sort of a practical historical aspect to it. And I would also say, just worth noting, it has been not just U.S. and South Korea, but during periods of détente with North Korea, this has also become part of this kind of way of trying to have some sense of connection. There's been moments, even most recently after the 2018 sort of Singapore summit, they decided to South Korea and North Korea said they were going to work together on some of these projects. And North Korea actually did deliver some remains of soldiers that were in their capacity. And South Korea has actually picked up on some of those recently, doing some of its own excavation work at places like Arrowhead Ridge, which was supposed to be done with North Korea, but North Korea basically dropped out of it in the past. But it is as well, something that in better times is another way to kind of try and bridge the gap between South and North as well.
Right. Chloe, late last month, that is late May, 2 French veterans of the Korean War were laid to rest in the southern port city of Busan. Could you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, so it's interesting to note that they were laid to rest in the words-only UN, so United Nations Cemetery, that is in Busan. It's holding the remains of more than 2,300 soldiers from 14 nations that fought into the Korean War that we were speaking about before. So the soldiers, the French soldiers, were Warrant Officer Jacques Grisolet and Corporal André Dachary. They both volunteered in the French UN battalion during the war, and they wished to be buried in Busan alongside 44 other fallen soldiers from that same company, so French soldiers as well. So there was a military ceremony with some of the Korean representatives of the army, also the vice minister of the veterans, and on the French side was also the families of the deceased, and the French ambassador was also here. So it was really interesting to see that, because the fact that there was their will to come back in the country where they have fought, voluntarily coming with the UN battalion, was interesting. So the daughter of one of them, Jacques Grisolet, she said that he will rest in peace on Korean soil, on this incredible country that he loved. And another interesting thing is kind of a parallel with what Thomas was saying about the US and Korean relationship. Same thing with French and the Korean relationship through that war, because the French ambassador reminded that disengagement of the French battalion in the war was also a strong part actually of the relationship between the two countries that are this year actually celebrating the 140 years anniversary of relationship. So he was saying that it was actually important to remember that the fact that French soldiers have fought on Korean soil for Korean liberty and freedom was also something that was linking the two countries even more.
Right, of course. Thomas, back to South Korea and the US. Why is the Korean War referred to as the forgotten war in the US? And before you answer that particular question, perhaps we could start with how the US became involved in the Korean War.
Right. So, as I'm sure you and most of the viewers here know, that North Korea invaded the South on June 25th, 1950, and really very quickly afterwards, the U.S. under President Truman, decided it was going to send troops. I mean, got a UN, went to the UN Security Council, the relatively new United Nations at that point, to get support, and U.S. troops were here kind of within a week or so to support South Korea. And I mean, it was a large, the idea that it's a forgotten war, and I certainly, before I lived in Korea, myself, it was really not something that I felt like I had a great sense of. But, just the numbers were, it was more than 1.7 million US soldiers were here. Over 36,000 were killed, 100,000 plus were injured, and there's still roughly 7,400 or so missing. Many of those are in North Korea. So the numbers are quite large, but as to why it's forgotten, I mean, it's a lot of reasons, but clearly it came not that long after World War II, and it's sort of seen as being squeezed between World War II and the Vietnam War. And I think for people back in the US, it didn't have the same kind of immediacy. World War II had literally rationing, it wasn't being fought on US shores. I mean, there was Pearl Harbor attack, but people's lives were impacted by it in a material way. There was rationing and just war production efforts, and the Korean War didn't really have that. The Korean War was also the first of this kind of Cold War geopolitical maneuvering, where it was, from the US interest anyway, a lot of it was about countering the rise of communism and this kind of fear of the domino theory, which later kind of led to, was another reason why the US got involved in Vietnam. And that's, I think it's not as salient or tangible to people back home as to why are we over there. It ended in a stalemate. It didn't have that sense of maybe closure. So there's just a lot of reasons. I mean, we were talking before coming on camera, just even about it doesn't have a large presence in popular culture. There's not that many films about it. I mean, there are some and books, but it's not like Vietnam came to occupy and still does occupy such a massive place in the American imagination and history. It was such a wrenching, traumatic experience. And World War II was more of maybe this sense of the U.S. doing something great in the world and heroic, and Korea just kind of falls in that gap. And but when you look at the actual numbers, and I mean the immense amount of suffering and tragedy behind it, it is surprising. I mean, for me personally, I don't think I realized until much later on. I mean, you don't learn about it in school, and I mean, you learn, but it's not in any way, shape, or form kind of considered such a, as important as the other two wars that book ended. So, yeah, it's an interesting thing about it, but maybe, the more that South Korea and the U.S. continue to work on these sorts of projects, the more that will get its due place in history.
Right, raise greater awareness about it, of course. Chloe, do tell us a bit about the French participation in the Korean War.
Yeah, so they were actually French United Nations battalion. So they were part of the military coalition under the UN that was led by the United States. 16 countries were participating, I think. And so for the French people, it was done in multiple times. So the first batch of volunteers that were sent, there were 1,017 volunteers at first, and then they were slowly, replaced, and also there were some more people coming in. So at the end, in total, there was 3,400 soldiers who came from France on this French battalion. There is between 2069 to 2087 deaths accounted for. So I've seen multiple sources that have been giving different numbers, but this is the amount of people that were killed. And then 1,400 were wounded. So for example, it's interesting to see that, we were speaking before about the French veterans who were laid to rest in Busan. One of them was wounded actually twice in South Korea. So I think he was wounded once, get to rest, and then came back, was wounded again. So there were most of them were actually wounded. And according to the numbers today, there's still 17 veterans that are alive in France. I think most of them are living in France at the moment. So yeah, still 17 veterans alive today.
17 veterans are alive in 2026.
Yep.
Most likely then they were teenagers when they were in the war then.
I think so.
Early
They were
20s.
probably quite young. Yeah.
Right. Thomas, later this year, the city of Busan, it will host its annual event aimed at honoring the sacrifice of the soldiers in the Korean War. Could you tell us a bit about this event?
Yes, so this is in November. I think it's usually held November 11th, and it's called Turn Toward Busan. And it started in 2007. I think it was the idea of a Canadian former, a veteran who served here. Basically, it meant to honor the UN veterans who fought in the war, and it is at the site of this Busan, the UN Memorial Cemetery in Busan, which Chloe had mentioned. And it sounds like a relatively simple ceremony. At 11 a.m., sirens sound, and then there's a moment of silence held, and then there are some, speeches and ceremonies within the cemetery. And it's just basically meant to honor the entire, UN forces that served. And I think, as Chloe also mentioned, this is the only UN cemetery in the world, so it is a special place. And last year, General Brunson, the head of the U.S. Forces Korea, mentioned, he described it as honoring the moment when the world stood shoulder to shoulder for peace, and that's the sense of it. So, it's one of these efforts to keep the spirit of this alive. I mean, there's also something that the Korean Ministry of Patriots and Veterans does called the Revisit Korea program, and sometimes that's tied up at the same time, and that's to bring back veterans from the war, and they sponsor, they provide usually like the whole package, airfare and accommodation and meals and some cultural activities. And since 1975, around 34,000 veterans and family members have taken part in this. It's just, it's something that I think to see, I don't know if you've been to this cemetery or, even here at the Seoul National Cemetery, I mean, it does give a different face on what war actually is about. I mean, as much as you study it historically and the meanings and the great figures of it, you soon realize the people that fought and died were often just so young kids, and it's something really, moving and worth, remembering that the human side of that, obviously, and all the suffering, of course, that Koreans of all stripes felt during that war. So, I mean, these are, it's symbolic, but it's obviously got a meaningful component to it.
Right, for sure, Thomas. Chloe, what are your thoughts with regard to South Korea's efforts to honor the sacrifice of the soldiers of the Korean War?
So I do think it's quite a good way to do it and a good initiative. Obviously, as Thomas was saying, we are all studying history and you can study it in a very dry way. But the fact that they decide to also go through memories and trying to do some meaningful events is also a good way to put humans back into the story. I've seen recently, for example, the Seoul city. I've not been yet, but I know they have been putting some specific monuments where you can learn a bit more about the other countries who came to help through the war, and there is some testimonies, some interviews done with veterans. So I think this is the whole idea of through people and through personal memories, you're making people understand a bit more about the war, and it makes it more meaningful. Because again, as said previously by Thomas, this story, this idea of the forgotten war, I would agree with that because it's not widely known. The same for us in France. We do learn about the Korean War, but I don't think, my memories of high school are quite blurry now, but I don't think we even studied the fact that France sent a battalion through the United Nations. So I feel like the more you can get countries, especially other countries that have been part of the war, knowing about this and their involvement, I guess it will also help bring forward this history.
Right, for sure, Chloe. I'm afraid that's all the time we have, so we'll have to end our discussion here. But Chloe, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for your insights, Thomas.
Thank you.
Right, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. As always, thank you for watching and see you back here same time tomorrow.